Today let's take up the solvency ratios from the lesson accounting ratios. First of all, let's see what solvency ratios are. Solvency ratios basically tells the user about the firm's capacity to meet its long-term obligations or debts, right? So here we have written this: solvency ratios conveys to the user the firm's ability to meet its long-term debts. Fine. Now the important solvency ratios are the debt equity ratio, total assets to debt ratio, and the proprietary ratio. Now first of all, we will be looking at the debt equity ratio. Now let's see what is a debt. Fine. So here the debt basically means the long-term loans, right? So when I say long-term loans, it means debentures and loans that are long-term loans from financial institutions, right? Now let's come to this equity. Now equity refers to shareholders' funds. Now shareholders' funds will be equity share capital, preference share capital, then you have reserves, if you have profit, then they have to be added to the reserves. So I'll write here profits to be added and loss is to be subtracted from reserves, right? So this is basically equity share capital, preference share capital, reserves, and from this we have to deduct the fictitious assets like preliminary expenses. Right? So when I say equity means shareholders' funds. So shareholders' funds is the total of, so I'll write the total of equity share capital, preference share capital, reserves. If it is a profit, we have to add that. If it is a loss, it has to be subtracted, and whatever you get, the total you get from this, from that we will have to subtract any fictitious assets if it is given in the question, like preliminary expenses, right? The ideal debt equity ratio is 2:1. That is the generally acceptable debt equity ratio, right? When you have a high debt equity ratio, it indicates a risky financial position, whereas a low debt equity ratio indicates a safe financial position, right? Now let's look at a small question for debt equity ratio. I'll put down the question here. Total assets is 12,50,000. Total debt is 10 lakh. Current liabilities is 5 lakh. That's it. From this you will have to calculate the debt equity ratio, right? Now let's look at the solution for this. Now in this, okay, before going to this, let me put down the formula for debt equity ratio. Debt equity ratio will be equal to debt, that is your long term loans, right, upon equity, that is the shareholders funds. Okay, so this is the formula for calculating the debt equity ratio. Okay, now let's come to the solution of this question. Now here you see you have been given the total assets, total debts are given to you, and current liabilities is given, right? When I say total debts actually refers to the total liabilities, right? So when we say debts are basically liabilities. So we have this here it has been given total debts is equal to 10 lakh and current liabilities is given as 5 lakhs, right? So this total debt is nothing but it is your total liabilities. Fine. So total liabilities is given and the current liabilities is given. Now if you have to calculate the long term debts, long term loans are basically your long term debts. Long term debts will be equal to the total debts minus the current liabilities. So you have to remember this formula. So long term debts is equal to total debts. Total debts is how much? 10 lakh minus the current liabilities is 5 lakhs. So the long term debts or the long term loans, that comes to 5 lakhs, right? Now the next one is the shareholders funds. In some of the questions they may have given the shareholders funds directly, but here it is not given. So let's see how to calculate that. Shareholders fund we have to do. Now we know the total assets and we also know the total liabilities, right? So here shareholders funds will be equal to the total assets minus the total debts, right? Now when we say total debts is only the other liabilities apart from your shareholders funds, right? So as we know that the asset side and the liability side of the balance sheet should tally, and the liability side also includes the shareholders funds, right? So this formula, this comes, shareholders fund will be equal to the total assets minus total liabilities. So whatever remains will be your shareholders fund. So here we have the total assets as 12,50,000 minus the total debt is 10 lakh, right? So that comes to 2,50,000. So now you can see this total assets that is given here, this is 12,50,000. Now total debt is 10 lakhs and this total shareholders fund that you calculated now is 2,50,000. So this 10 lakh plus 2,50,000, this is equal to 12,50,000, which will be your liability side, that is equal to the asset side. Understood? So the shareholders funds will be 2,50,000. Now you have to calculate the debt equity ratio. This will be equal to your long term loans upon shareholders funds. So this will be equal to long term loans is 5 lakhs upon shareholders funds is 2,50,000. So the ratio comes to 2:1. So that is your debt equity ratio, right? Now let's look at one more question for this debt equity ratio. We have this question: 10,000 equity shares of rupees 10 each, right? Then I have 5,000 9% preference shares of rupees 10 each. Then we have general reserve 45,000, profit and loss account, this is 30,000, 10% debentures is given as 75,000, current liabilities is given as 50,000, and preliminary expenses is given as 10,000. You have to calculate the debt equity ratio, right? Now in this question, the long term loans, first of all, that is your debt, right? So long term loans is only is equal to your 10% debentures, that is given. So this 10% debentures is how much? 75,000, right? Now you have to find the shareholders funds. Now in this case, the shareholders funds will be like this: equity share capital plus preference share capital plus general reserve plus profit and loss account. This is a profit, it is to be added, right? And preliminary expenses are given, which is a fictitious asset, so preliminary expenses has to be subtracted. So this comes to equity share capital is, they have given 10,000 shares of rupees 10 each, which is 1 lakh rupees, plus 5,000 shares of rupees 10 each, that is the preference share capital, so this is 50,000, plus general reserve is 45,000, plus profit and loss account is 30,000, minus 10,000 is your preliminary expense. So this comes to 1 lakh plus 50,000 plus 45,000 plus 30,000, which is 2,25,000, minus 10,000, it comes to 2,15,000, right? So now you have the long term loans here, and you have the shareholders funds here, right? So now we calculate the debt equity ratio for this. The debt equity ratio, let's write down the formula first, is equal to, you can write either debt upon equity, or you can write long term loans upon shareholders funds, right? It's one and the same thing. Now here this will be equal to, the debt is 75,000 upon 2,15,000. 75,000 upon 2,15,000 works out to 0.348. So we'll put it as 0.348 is to 1. So you can round it off, you can put it as 0.35 is to 1. So this will be the final answer for the debt equity ratio. This is 0.35 is to 1. Okay, so this is how you calculate the debt equity ratio. So basically this is the formula for debt equity ratio: debt upon equity, that is long term loans upon shareholders funds. And the basic thing you have to remember here is what are debts and what are equities, right? So these are the basic things here. Once you know what is to be included in the shareholders funds and what is to be included in the debt, the formula is quite easy. You just have to substitute the values there, right? And one more thing you have to remember is this one, which I have written here, this formula: long term debts is equal to total debts minus current liabilities, and this shareholders fund is equal to total assets minus total debts, right? So we have seen two examples of debt equity ratio here, different types of examples for debt equity ratio. So with that, I come to the end of this topic on debt equity ratio. Thank you.